So, like I said, welcome everybody to the third night of this George Washington Leadership Lessons. I really appreciate everybody's time and input that they give on the previous sessions. And what I wanted to do this evening is go through the next group of chapters. That would be chapters 8, 9, and 10, and 11. And then next week, we round out with the last 4 chapters going up through chapter 15. What I think a lot of us are going to start to see is that there's a lot of carryover between these different concepts and ideas, meaning that we may talk about a leader being a good communicator, but that communication skill also carries over into how a leader conducts themselves, how they present themselves, and how they really deliver their message to everybody else in their organization or on their team. So as we start to look at these different leadership traits and these lessons, keep in mind that there is what I would call some spillover into other areas as well. To start us off, we have chapter 8, which is a leader has a strong work ethic. And a couple of the notes that I had down here is, a leader is really the first one last out. And it doesn't necessarily mean the leader is doing a lot of physical labor. Sometimes I think we think in terms of work ethic as a lot of physical labor. How many bricks did you move from one side of the location to the other side of the location? Or how much coding did you do today? Or how many chapters did you write today? But really the first one last out philosophy is really setting the example and setting the tone for the rest of the team. We hear a lot within the sports analogies in sports worlds where sometimes it's not the most vocal person on the team that carries the most weight with the other players. It's the one that shows up. He's always the first one there, or she. They're studying film. They're looking over the playbooks. They're working hard in the gym. And then they're also staying after practice. They're putting in extra work. And a lot of times you hear one of the big critiques when a team isn't doing well, and I'm going to use football as the analogy. I'm in the South, so I almost feel like you have to use football as a sports analogy down here. And that is when a team's not doing well, a lot of times people will first look to the quarterback and look to see what his habits are. Is this person showing up early before everybody has to be there? How much preparation are they doing? How much are they working with other players, developing other players? You hear a lot about when quarterbacks will spend extra time after practice working with just the rookie wide receivers, throwing passes, getting into sync, and getting to understand how each player is going to interact with each other, when the ball's going to come out of the quarterback's hands and when the receiver can expect that ball. And, part of this too is the visibility that has can really carry over to what kind of respect you get from your team. And that's why I think being one of the first people into the office and one of the last ones out is important. And again, it's not necessarily that you're working and producing as much or more as anybody else, but the fact that you're there and the fact that the team sees your commitment to the outcome of the objective is what I think is important. The other item that stuck in my mind is that a leader maintains focus on the objective. And there's a very popular podcast called Entrepreneur on Fire. And the host of that podcast, John Lee Dumas, has this acronym, FOCUS. And he breaks that down into follow one course until success. And what that means is that the leader doesn't lose perspective, and they keep working at an objective until that one objective is done. Then they can pivot and focus their energy and work towards the other objectives. And what sometimes happens is that as a leader, you get bombarded with all sorts of information, all sorts of inputs that come to you. And the higher up in an organization you get, higher up in a team that you get, the more reports that you have and the more information that comes into you. And when a leader, I think, becomes unfocused and pivots too many directions at one time and doesn't stay on course to complete an objective, I think sometimes that lack of focus also will show itself and display itself to the team, maybe unfairly, that the leader really doesn't have a strong work ethic. And it's simply because of the distraction that comes about when you don't focus on one course until success. One other item that stuck out in my mind in this chapter is that leisure time is not wasted time. And what I mean by that is that even when Washington would be one of the first people up in the morning on his estates, riding around in the early morning before breakfast, check on how the progress of building a building or cultivating a field might work, he would also take time to visit with all the visitors that came to Mount Vernon, including fox hunts, including balls, including some of these other activities, which on the surface all seem like leisure activities. But they're not wasted time in that, Washington used that time, that downtime, that leisure time to help build his network. And one of the other ideas about leisure time not being wasted time, I think, comes from Tim Ferriss in the 4-Hour Work Week, where, he talks a little bit about if the goal of leisure time is to decompress, to let your mind go, to allow the creativity of the subconscious to come out, then that's not wasted time. But if you're just waking up and just going about the day without any kind of a plan, without any kind of some structure around what the outcome is for that leisure activity or that downtime, then that does tend to become wasted because you're not intent on what the outcome's supposed to be. And like I said, it goes hand in hand in my mind with a strong work ethic in being directed also towards how you use that leisure time. For example, yesterday, went out on the river, had a great time, met new people, expanded my network a little bit. But the idea of that time on the river was not to think about the coaching practice, was not to think about some of the other things going on in my life, but it was intention to be able to wipe the slate clean, so to speak, and start the week fresh and come at this week with focused intensity to make sure that I'm still reaching towards some of my goals. So it wasn't wasted time, but it was leisure time. Now, a couple of ways that Washington demonstrated a strong work ethic. And he started in business early in his life. I think the chapter brings out that by the time he was 17, he was a surveyor in Virginia and was already mapping out areas into the western part of the state. He was already making essentially the income of a lawyer at that time and taking some of those funds and plowing that back into purchasing land and expanding his estates. Talked a little bit about him being up early in the morning, typically 5 or 6 o'clock. He would ride around the estate, come back, then have breakfast, and then start the day formally. But he was always one of the first people up and around. And really what that gave him an opportunity to do was to see what the activity really was going on the estates. A lot of times the workforce is not out there yet. You don't have people that can tell you what their intentions are. You can just purely see, did that field get planted? What's the progress on those walls? How is the building construction coming? You don't have a filter there of somebody telling you what their intentions were, why they're going slow, what happened. you just get a pure, visible, idea and sense of where the work's going. Maintaining the focus on building Mount Vernon and his businesses until he died. At 17, we start talking about him purchasing land, working as a surveyor, being a self-starter, self-educated, expanding his networks. And then we go all the way through to up until the point he died, where he had started a distillery. He was looking to keep increasing his land holdings in the Ohio, and he was looking to keep, building out what Mount Vernon and what his estates could do. Now, with that being said, does anybody have any ideas, or does anybody have any comments on what do you think makes a strong work ethic? So I think, again, in my mind, it's not necessarily the person that lays the most tile. It's not necessarily the person who cuts the most wood, writes the most code, does whatever it is that in your profession. But it's the person that's up early, that's seeing through an objective, that's coming in and starting fresh and working until the job is done. That's the person that really demonstrates a strong work ethic. We can talk about speed. We can talk about how efficient they are. We can talk about all sorts of different things along those lines. But it's the idea of coming to work, working, and being focused, and then seeing the objective through, which leads my mind. Chapter 9, a leader uses good judgment. And this brought up a question in my mind, and the author tackled this a little bit, but what is good judgment? And the author was bringing out that good judgment is the ability to make smart decisions. And, smart decisions is always going to be slightly in the eye of the beholder. Sometimes the facts play themselves out that a decision was the correct decision or not the correct decision. Sometimes you don't know that the decision is what it is until you're far enough down and away from it to have the chance to look back and look at what other possible alternatives you had in front of you. So good judgment is, I don't know, to me it's something that is a little bit harder to really define. But some of the things that go into good judgment is the ability to gather the information and then make the decision. It's not taking polls. It's not making decisions and ruling or setting policy based upon what's popular at the time. What's popular at the time is not always what's in the best interest of your team, what's not always in the best interest of the company, or what's in the best interest of a nation. For example, at the time of the revolution really had support of maybe about a third of the populace. So you had a third that was for breaking with England. And then you had a third that was really hardcore, didn't want to break with England. And then you had about a third that was kind of in the middle. So if somebody was going to just take a poll over whether or not it's time to separate from England, create the United States, and take the colonies independent from the motherland, chances are the polls would have come back at, at least, let's say, close to a 70-30 split, maybe a 60-40 split for staying with England versus moving away from England. So, gathering information is really important, but not necessarily going with what the popular opinion is. And then once the decision's been made and the order's given, the leader cannot change course. That doesn't mean, in my mind, that as a situation changes, as new facts come to light, that as somebody matures, that you can't make a pivot, you can't change what your feelings are. But it means that within the short term, and that may be days, that may be months, it may be years, in the short term, making a quick change away from your decision really tends to lead, in my mind, to somebody that's not sure of their decision, who doesn't have the courage of their convictions. Now, one question I'd like to ask everybody and get some input on is, can good judgment be learned, or is it something that only comes from experience? Does anybody want to chime in on that?
I think, at least in the industry that I'm in, it's definitely something that can be learned. There's probably definitely an aspect of it that's experience too, but I think in almost every profession you go into, there are certain things that you have to know education-wise, and there are certain things that you have to know by the time you're in a leadership position. And those aren't always necessarily learning it because you've been in that situation so many times before. I think a lot of times it can be something, based on your knowledge of your team or based on your knowledge of your job, just something that you've learned and acquired.
Right. And I think too that goes along a little bit with my thoughts, in that I think it's a combination. I think you have some judgment that can maybe be inherent in an individual, and that could be based on risk tolerance, that could be based on a number of different personality characteristics, as well as experience. And that when you have both of those come into play, that's where good judgment starts to come out and starts to show itself. I think in the early examples we talked about, to an extent, and it's going to come up a little bit later in the examples, but when Washington was given command of Fort Necessity out during the French and Indian War, he did a really bad job with picking out the location of the fort, and then the fort defenses. He did a poor job, and some of that is that if you study it, he put the fort in a low position from a topography standpoint, meaning that the fort was in there. You had hills, you had rises all around the fort, so that essentially gives the enemy a position to shoot down at you. He also took his men out from behind the walls of the fort, threw up some makeshift earthworks in front, and had his men out in front of the fort. Instead of fighting behind the higher fortification walls, they were out front, facing the French and the Indians from not a very strong position. And he, of course, lost the fort, had to march back essentially in disgrace. We learned and talked about in the previous webinars about how he took responsibility, he learned from that, and then he was able to apply that later on in both his military career as well as in his personal life. Now, one thing I'd like to ask you guys too is, what are some of the results that you've seen of leaders changing their position quickly? And then what's your opinion of some of the leaders? And you can either give a specific example or even just talk at a high level of, what do you think? Does that erode the credibility of a leader or not? And would love to hear some thoughts on that.
This is Russell. I have a couple thoughts on that one.
Sure.
And in business over the years, it's something I've seen. It's one thing for businesses occasionally do need to change directions.
Right.
But I know for a number of years in one of the companies I worked in, it was the flavor of the month almost as to the corporate direction. And it was almost like, watching a pendulum swing back and forth, which direction the company was going. and what I watched in the developer ranks, or in the people who are trying to execute on the corporate strategy, is you're just about to actually get something done and the direction changes.
Right.
And so from the perspective from the top, because I was sitting right in between the two, the perspective from the top was that, man, we're just not getting anything done. And from the bottom was, I can't finish anything because every time I'm about done with something, you change, we're on a different course.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the things that was very painful. So, if we were to say a leader can't really, you need to pick a course and stick to it. I agree with that to a point. Because in order for the people you're leading, for those who are supposed to follow, or so those who are supposed to get behind it and help push, as opposed to just follow, they're supposed to pick it up and really help push the cause along. They have to believe that you believe it yourself, and you have to be committed to it. You have to, stick to it, even if it, seems a little tough. But the big thing in there is choosing carefully your direction. As a leader, you have to be careful what you choose, where you choose to point your vision, and make sure that you can back it up, and not just with, well, this feels right, this seems like the right thing to do. You have to back it up with some solid, understanding. If it be, market statistics, if it be, the statistics or data that backs up the decision. Those decisions in that direction need to be based in something that people can understand, at least at a certain level and far enough to get behind it and really push and support it. Then, once you've chosen that high level direction, you've got to give enough leeway to everybody under you so that, provided they understand the direction, that they can get in step with it and see how they contribute to it. And that really comes to be the most important thing, is in enabling other people. As a leader, your role isn't necessarily to just make stuff happen. You got to have other people make stuff happen.
Right.
And that's the hard part, is getting the other people excited, motivated, engaged in really making it happen. If they don't understand where they fit in that grand scheme and can't point with certainty to the impact they have to that, you're not going to be very effective. You may make some progress. You may actually accomplish it. But, the organizations that I've seen really succeed, boy, everybody up and down the chain of command, so to speak, had a clear understanding of the role they played in achieving the final goal.
Right. And, it was a couple of things that were really interesting there, Russell, was talking about it erodes away the people that are out there doing the work. It erodes away the morale, and I think it erodes away their faith in leadership when they see, the flavor of the month come through, whatever that might be in whatever industry might be, is that without being able to get behind and trust that leadership has good judgment. And that doesn't mean run the ship into the iceberg. Obviously, you got to make course corrections. You got to do different things as information comes available. But this pivoting left and right, in quick succession, just really, I think, translates into everybody else believing that leadership doesn't have the judgment to really guide the ship.
Yeah. Another point along there too is the importance of the leader is supposed to guide it, not drive it.
Right.
Think about the captain of an old sailing ship. His hands weren't usually on the wheel. He gave that to a navigator. The guy that was actually behind the wheel was usually not even an officer.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's the case in corporate and business, corporations and business, is the people who really make the difference are not the ones setting course direction.
Sure.
And the clear thing that the leader needs to understand is, what's the destination? And when things arise, what do we need to do to get around it, over it, through it, and keeping that in destination clearly in mind, and helping those around you understand that, look, we're making a course change. The goal is still the same. We've had a change in how we're going to accomplish it. We've had a change in, hey, we discovered something that a competitor is doing and we need to take advantage of, whatever it might be, or we need to do something to defend against it. And it's not necessarily a change in the ultimate direction. It's a change in the strategy for achieving it.
Sure. Well, and, let's go ahead and take a look at how Washington exercised or demonstrated good judgment. You know, when he was put in charge of the Continental Army, some of the French were coming over and they were sending some of their nobles, and Lafayette is a great example of this. Lafayette is about, for those of you that read the book, I'm hoping not to, go over too much, ground that you've already done, but Lafayette's 19 years old. He's part of the French nobility. He shows up. He has some education. He has some different traits, and comes in and is essentially appointed the general of the Continental Army. But there's Americans or colonials that are older, have more militia experience, fought in the Indian and French and Indian War. But Washington really stayed with Lafayette, and Lafayette really became, and the book calls this out, really becomes something of a son to Washington. But Lafayette really proved himself throughout the war and really proved himself as a leader for the Continental Army, to the point that when Lafayette comes back to visit America after the war, he's greeted a hero's welcome just about everywhere he goes. Meaning, city business shuts down. He's traveling through Philadelphia, New York, wherever, and he's the guest of honor to the colony and to the city. And then also, too, for those that are really history buffs, and I'm smiling a little bit because this is probably a little bit of trivia that folks may not know, but when the Americans go to France in World War I, and General Pershing is the one leading the American Expeditionary Force, his statement when he arrives at France and the Americans are coming in after 4 years of long war and the French just about being beat, his statement is, "Lafayette, we are here." So that shows how important I think Lafayette was to the American cause. And Washington was also able to look past the physical or outward appearance of some of the people that rose to power within the Army. General Greene and General Knox, I won't spend a lot of time on either one, but neither of them had military experience before the war. And both of them, as the book points out, became active participants in the Revolution before the Declaration of Independence, and then all the way through to the end. General Knox becoming the first Secretary of War and is given credit for launching and producing the Navy. So both of these individuals, and if you hadn't read their stories, go into the book, read the couple of paragraphs on each one, and then if you want to, do a Google search, read a little bit more. But the ability for Washington to spot some talent and put the talent in the right place was very important. Washington was also okay with putting rivals into areas of influence, meaning he brought Jefferson into his cabinet as Secretary of State. He brought Hamilton in. He brought people in that really disagreed with each other. And to the point of, in Jefferson's case and in some of the other cases, actively trying to undermine or second guess Washington during his presidency. And finally, Washington demonstrated good judgment where his decisions were not negotiable. When the Whiskey Rebellion pops up, and that's the rebellion against the taxes on spirits, when that pops up, Washington takes to the head of the army and marches an army that's one of the largest ones, or larger than what he ever commanded in the field during the Revolution, out to western Pennsylvania to put down that rebellion. His decision about having a federal form of government and the ability for that government to put out taxes was not negotiable. He wasn't going to deal with this uprising, and he wasn't going to try to make compromises. The decision he made was a final decision. And that also tails back to when we were discussing crossing the Delaware, where he needed to give his army some victories. He heard all the risks. He heard people's aversions from crossing the Delaware in December. But once he made his decision, that was it. The course was set, and it was time to move on. So in chapter 10, a leader learns from mistakes. And I love this quote that Oscar Wilde had in this chapter here. Experience is simply the name we give our mistakes. And I just really like that, because a lot of times the only way that we learn is from that experience. We can learn not to do things because there are consequences. Similar to a child learns not to reach for a stove because the child's mother slaps the child's hand. Child doesn't really understand that the stove is hot. He or she could pull the pot over onto themselves, spilling hot liquid and burning themselves. The only thing the child understands is that there's a punishment for even trying to make that choice. But what really sticks with people is that experience. And what we want to try to do is learn from that mistake and don't make it again. And in doing that, learning sometimes can come through in the form of mentors, and it can come through in coaches, it can come through in self-study. And if we're open to that experience that somebody else has had, we don't necessarily have to go through it ourselves. Are we still learning from experience? I think we are, but we're learning from somebody else's experience, and we're listening to what they said the results were. Now, one of the common things that's out here now in some of the podcasts and some of the literature is really what the startup business is learning to get in, make mistakes fast, learn, get up and progress, and then make another mistake, learn, get up, move, progress. So there's a lot of emphasis on speed and development, and which I think is great, because my own personality is one where I like to sit back, study a little bit, learn a little bit more, think about it a little bit, and then get in and make some action, take some action steps, right? And then you've got other people too that want to just do the old fire, aim, ready standpoint, where folks are ready to jump in and move forward and do all sorts of things. And the idea that you could make a mistake, learn from it, get up, make a mistake again, and that's acceptable, is something that I think organizations and leaders can do to help move themselves along and gain some of this experience that also feeds back into the idea of using good judgment. If judgment is both from a personality standpoint, an education standpoint, and then an experience standpoint, sometimes what you need is that experience to really hammer home what comes into making a good judgment call as a leader. I want to take a look at how Washington learned. Yes.
So I just had a thought on the whole concept of making mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
because that is something that everybody's going to make mistakes, and every business is going to make mistakes. And I think, and I appreciate your thoughts on it, but I think there's just one other one I'd like to add to that.
Sure.
And that really is along the lines of, we don't necessarily encourage mistakes. What we encourage is effort. We encourage creativity. We encourage take a risk.
Right.
Take an educated risk. It's kind of like the old adage of the talents.
Mm-hmm.
You reward him for putting it in a hole and then bringing it back to you, unincreased. No, that's not the point. The point is do something with it. And sometimes that's not always going to work, but it's one of those things that if you have somebody that's consistently making the same mistake, okay, you got to work them over. But
right.
At the same time, you don't want to discourage somebody who's got an idea. You want them to engage. You want them to go do something about it. because those are the kind of people that when they have ideas and they know that creativity and that forethought is going to reward them, whether it be with a recognition of that just forward thinking, or whether it be monetary or in some other form, it's going to really motivate them to do that again. And that's really going to push an organization forward.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. And one of the ideas too with that is knowing, as leader, knowing the difference when your team is making a non-fatal error or mistake and when they're about to make a fatal error. Non-fatal error is something that may set a project back, maybe taking some risky behavior that doesn't pay off, maybe doing something that won't necessarily kill the organization, kill the project, may not, completely disable what it is you're trying to do, but it allows for that risk taking. It allows for that mistake to happen and the team to learn. Because on the other side of that, what you were saying as well is that if you punish all mistakes as if they were fatal mistakes, and you dismiss people, you punish people however you want to do it, the risk taking comes to a halt. Nobody wants to propose something that's going to be different from the norm. Nobody's going to want to take a step out and maybe take the organization into a new area of service or products because they're afraid to raise their hand. Because if it doesn't work out, the penalty for that is going to be so great, it's not worth the risk. And so thanks for bringing that up. A couple of ways that we talked about Washington learning from his mistakes was the self-study and developing a network that included his mentors. And some of this was where he was able to go ahead and plow into some of the classical texts and work with his mentors. I keep bringing up the Fairfaxes, but he was able to work with them. And after his defeat at Fort Necessity and after his experience as a young colonel, remember Washington was 22, 23 years old when he was a colonel in the Virginia militia fighting the French and Indian War. When he came back, he probably had a lot of fence mending, a lot of things that he had to accept, which we had talked about previously, that he owned up to the mistake. But he had to rebuild his reputation as well. And so from a military standpoint, Washington learned that it wasn't smart to build or defend forts when fighting the British. And for the reason that is because forts tended to indicate areas of control. And when the colonial army had started out, these guys are a bunch of farmers. These guys are a bunch of untrained militia fighting the best fighting force in continental Europe. And if you concentrate all your people in one spot, the British could come in, defeat you, capture, and essentially if they take the army prisoner, you've got nobody else to fight and carry on the revolution. And Washington, again, he learned to retreat or not engage the British. When the battles were going poorly, when he was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, he quickly learned how to retreat and not engage. And that kept his army intact, which kept the British having to send over supplies, had to keep the British on American soil. And when they were going into Valley Forge, he brought in somebody again, Frederick von Steuben. It was a Persian military officer, and von Steuben comes in and he sets up the processes and he sets up the training for the colonial militias that really forged them into more of a European-style army. And some of the documents and some of the processes that von Steuben brought in were in practice with the United States Army up through close to the beginning of the United States Civil War. And, all of these things that Washington ended up doing were all based upon what he learned from his mistakes. He knew he had to go out and get experts. He knew he had to come up with a new way of fighting the British. He couldn't go toe-to-toe with the British, at least not in the early years. And he had to rely on that network of mentors to help guide his decision-making, to help him repair his reputation, to help him stay relevant within society of Virginia and the colonies as a whole. And, this chapter here, a leader is humble. This one, it gets to be interesting because a lot of times I think we perceive leaders as a false modesty in some cases. And there's a couple of ways that leaders can, I think, prevent that sense of having a false modesty. And part of that is going to be they take criticism personally. And what I mean by that is they don't let it necessarily beat them down in that sense. But they take responsibility, may have been a better word to use here. They take responsibility for the criticism. And going back to my sports analogy, when you see a football team lose, and it may have been the defense that actually lost the game for a particular team, but you'll see sometimes the quarterback or you'll see the coach come out and say, you know what, I just wasn't as accurate as I should have been. This loss is on me. We're going to have to go back and do better. That person, that leader on that team, will take in that criticism because they know that they have to do that in order to protect the good of the whole team. And the praise goes out to the rest of the team. So when they win, one of the things you see a leader do, again, in a sports sense, is that quarterback who took all the blame last week, this week will talk about how great the kicker was, how great their defensive line was, how great the offensive line was, how great everybody else was. And he was just happy to be there. And, sometimes that's a sports cliche, but I think in leadership, you have to do it that way, and you have to mean it. You can't do it one time and accept all the praise goes to yourself and then turn around, and when it becomes a very public display, then go out and praise your team. You have to be prepared even when you're just, I think, in one-on-one meetings, to thank whoever's giving you the praise, but then also refer it back out to the team and make sure that they understand. They accept that they may not be up to the task. Everybody gets a little nervous sometimes when you're leveling up. You're taking an advancement, you're moving into a different direction in your professional life or your personal life, and you accept that you may not be up to that task. And I think what that does is that shows that, one, you're willing to take the risk, you're willing to go in and you're willing to step up and become that leader, but you know that at that moment you might not be up to the task. And that doesn't mean not to take the risk. That doesn't mean to pass up on the promotion. What that means is that it may be something you're going to need to grow into. And, a leader will defer to other people when their time is over. And from a political standpoint, Washington did a good job, and I think I'll get into this in the next slide. But when your time is over as a leader, when you step down, when you move aside, a good leader is going to be somebody who is going to defer back to whoever replaced them. They're not going to stay actively engaged in the discussions because it undermines the person that comes after them. And what I mean by that is if you're the leader of one team and you step aside, the person that's replacing you and stepping up into your former role, that person is going to have to grow into that role. That person may not make decisions the same way as you. And when people come to you asking you what your opinion is about such and such, answering and becoming actively engaged in that discussion undermines that other leader. And so a leader knows that when it's time to step down, that they also step aside as far as not actively discussing policy, actively not discussing decision making that's going on in the position that they've left. And finally, the leader doesn't fall in love with the trappings. I mean, how great would it be to have Air Force One, to have Marine One, to have access to Camp David, to be able to vacation anywhere and do anything you want to? You know, for a couple of years, that sounds like a great life. And it's something that Washington could have fallen in with and just keep enjoying being president and stayed in. He was overseeing the Capitol. He was overseeing a lot of different things. But a leader doesn't fall in love with the trappings of leadership and with what that position has. They know that when it's time to go, it's time to go. And there might be some perks, and there's obviously some things that you take along with you, but that's not why you're there, and that's not why you're a leader. At least that's not what the great leaders have in common. So how was Washington humble? He openly talked about not being equal to the tasks that were given to him. I think when he accepted command of the Army, he talked about, that he may not be the best choice for this, but that he would give it everything he had. When accomplishing anything truly special, he almost always gave credit to God. And he may not, if you read any of his writings or any of his speeches, he may not always reference God. At that time too, it was also something where you'd reference providence. So you could read providence and God as being almost interchangeable at that point. He did give up command of the Army. I think at this point when he did that, even King George had talked about that if Washington gave up command of the Army, that Washington would be the greatest man alive at that time. That nobody with that much power simply gives up that power and walks away. At his Adams' inauguration, Adams got up to speak. He was newly elected president. Jefferson, again, was younger than Washington. Jefferson had sometimes openly acted against Washington as Washington's Secretary of State, had put a lot of things in the newspapers. And at that point, Washington could have stood up and had his words, but he deferred to Jefferson, who was younger, who was as the new vice president. And that really was a nod that Washington didn't have any power anymore, that the mantle of leadership had been passed over to Adams and Jefferson. And then finally, he did resign from government. There was no rules at that time on how many terms a president could serve. He served 2 terms, 8 years, and then retired to Mount Vernon, and pretty much completely withdrew from politics. Didn't give any public statements or comments about the current government, which really was a tradition that most presidents followed down until recent times. I think it's only about the last 20 years or so that you really start to see former presidents commenting and actively giving their opinion about whether they agree or disagree with a sitting president. So, a good tradition, I think, that was in place and really helped to set the tone of this idea of a Mr. President and not a Your Excellency, or not, something of a much higher stature in title than just simply Mr. President. So in my opinion, a very humble handover of government and a very humble position to take. Now, one thing I'd like to ask is if anybody has anything that they would like to share. You know, anything in these last chapters that really stuck out with you or struck a chord, and then, you know, how do you see putting some or all of these lessons into practice in your life? And then finally, what areas do you think you could improve on? And we don't have to answer that one out loud, of course. And it's just something to think about, again, with our goal of being just taking some incremental steps forward so that by the, you know, a certain time, we're a lot further down the path of leadership and being really good leaders than we were when we started this experience. So does anybody have anything that they would like to share? I think one thing that really stuck out with me this week has been the idea of being humble and the idea of how to learn from those mistakes. Sometimes I get caught up with banging my head against the wall, so to speak, and occasionally making the same mistake a couple of different times. You know, and I think that falls in line with what Einstein said, what the definition of insanity is: doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And so sometimes it can be tough to learn from mistakes. Sometimes it's hard to swallow what those lessons are. But I think by doing that, you gain a little bit more experience. You gain a little bit more knowledge so that you can make better decisions, so you can exercise better judgment, right, with your team, with yourself, with your family. And so those are a couple of the things that I just want to leave you guys with this week. Next week, we'll cover the last 4 chapters of this book. They are: a leader does the research and development, leader values presentation, and a leader exceeds expectations, and a leader has heartfelt faith. One of the things that may or may not know is that Washington, you know, wasn't necessarily the most church-going individual, but I think if you go back and read some of his documents, he had a lot of faith. You see, you know, in his writings that even though he might not have been front row center in a pew every Sunday, there was a lot of faith there. There was a lot of, you know, time alone to exchange ideas, exchange prayers with God. And so I think that'll be a nice point to wrap up on. So in the meantime, if anybody has any questions whatsoever, anything that they want to share with me offline, please feel free to do so. But otherwise, I really do appreciate everybody's time and stopping in. It's an hour out of your busy week, and I really appreciate you guys sharing that with me. So I hope everybody has a great week, and I look forward to seeing everybody next weekend. And take care now.